Welcome back to the Runner Zone podcast. I'm here again with Chris. Chris, how's your day going?
It's going good, man. I have the whole house to myself. No barking Pomeranian. Lulu is
Oh,
with
nice.
Mimi, and feel like it's
Yeah,
back to bachelorhood.
yeah. I have the same thing for the next 2 hours. So this is one of my kids' last day of school, and so my wife and our other kid is taking him lunch right now. So there's like 2 hours till chaos will resume, and then we'll go have fun because it's been the last day of school. So try to work now
It
and then.
sounds like a college schedule, where
Yeah,
they're
I know,
they're
man.
out in May. I think our
Yeah.
kids are. I think they wrap up in mid-June. So
Oh,
yeah, I
dang,
say
man.
keep them in school as long as possible.
Yeah, I feel that from a work
Yeah,
perspective, I would agree with you on that. It's definitely a different beast
yeah,
when your kids are at home or at
for
work.
sure.
Well, cool. So we haven't done an episode like this in a while. We've had a lot of clinical stuff, which it seems to have been getting a good response. But you and I both thought that this would be a good time to kind of approach the topic of you know where do you go across your career? How do you look across it? Um, and kind of our experiences so far, the good, the bad, what we've learned when we're, working with businesses and other, or just having clinicians that, connect with us at courses or on social media or anywhere else and kind of share some of, our experience through that. So I think it'd be helpful to start with, we both touched on our career paths, but just to kind of quickly go over you and then maybe me about kind of your trajectory up to this point, maybe where you started, what you thought you were going to do, and then how that's played out since then.
Yeah, so I would say my physical therapy career officially, or when I started really going down this path, started when I returned to University of Delaware after transferring to Boston College for one semester of my sophomore year. Um, when I got back to Delaware, I connected with Lynn Snyder Mackler. She was kind enough to allow me to join her research team. So I was in her lab from sophomore year, essentially through grad school. I stayed at University of Delaware for PT school. Barely got in because I didn't pass a GRE the first time. That's a whole separate story. But so I stayed at Delaware for grad school. They had a phenomenal program. And it was through these relationships that I had sort of nurtured where I ended up at the Nicholas Institute of Sports Medicine because Lynn Snyder Mackler was friends with Mal McHugh, who was a director of research. So they essentially, I don't know if they created a spot for me, but I basically had just a great opportunity to go up, so I took advantage of it, and I stayed at NISMAT for roughly 8 years, and then I was getting pulled into a lot of clinical care, and I'm to deliver the experience that I wanted to for patients seeking my services. I ended up branching out and doing my own thing, and that's when I formed Chris Johnson PT PLLC. Did that for a few years. Left New York having saved a decent chunk of change, which not many people can say. And then Mimi and I made the decision to brave the move cross country to settle down and start a life in Seattle, really with the ultimate goal of starting a family. And when I got out here, I took a position with a group called Olympic PT or Olympic Physical Therapy, and they were great. Jen and Larry Post were kind enough to bring me on board, but I quickly realized after my stint in New York, where I was running my own show, that I was no longer employable. And I think that's something
Yeah,
you may
I can I
you
can
may
relate to
echo
that.
too. Yeah.
So yeah, so
In
in those
so
early
I
years at
yeah.
NISMAT, what served as like I know that you played sports growing up, so you probably had a philosophy maybe around training, and I think that training and rehab obviously there's a lot of similarities there. What do you feel like? How did you kind of establish your framework for working with patients? Because there are different approaches to that, right? So there's like certain schools of thought and these different certifications, or you can, be this type of PT, more hands-on, more exercise, more whatever. What was the initial kind of what kind of set your foundation in how you treat patients?
I would say that because I was at NISMAT, which is essentially a orthopedic and sports physical therapy think tank, I was always forced. There was no choice. I had to read the research because otherwise, Mal McHugh would just lay into me. If I started making points when we were at the Tuesday core curriculums, which are essentially roundtable discussions on a certain topic, people would just hand you your ass on a platter if you weren't speaking in denominators or what was published in the research. But I also, as you and I both know, when you're in the clinic, it's a little bit messy. The research teaches you how to think. It doesn't teach you how to treat patients. That's a quote from Jay DeSherry that I love. So I would just dabble in a bunch of courses. I was taking a lot of the principles of manual medicine from Phil Greenman. I was dabbling in some of the Maitland stuff. I was reading anything I could get my hands on and spending time around a lot of practitioners in our field as well as outside of our field. And I think all of that started in similar to you, and we'll get into your background a little bit. I was treating everything under the sun. I had people coming in after hip replacements, Bankart procedures after shoulder dislocations, slap repairs, cuff repairs, ACL reconstructions, Brostrom procedures, like you name it, I treated it. And I think that was invaluable. And I liken it to almost like being a multi-sport athlete growing up. And then over time, I started to really gravitate towards running and sort of niching down. I was racing triathlon. So it just seemed like a natural evolution of where I wanted to focus my time and energy. So,
And when did
yeah, how about
coaching
you?
start? When did coaching start? And how did that happen?
Well, I always laugh when I get that question because I started coaching when I was literally 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I was teaching primarily tennis, but I would also help out with soccer. But I used to teach at clubs in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, so I was handling, adult group classes. I was handling working with young kids. I had worked at a couple private clubs. I had worked with a couple in a couple different settings that were, really more serving the general public. But I started to really double down on coaching when I was in New York, and I started branching off. And when I did my own thing, when I got out of NISMAT, um, and I've really that's been a big part of my my professional focus these days.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about, give us a lens into your background. Where you went to
Yeah.
PT school, what the early days looked like, and just how things have evolved.
Yeah, and we both touched on this when we talked about lifting a little bit, so I won't rehash everything. But so I went to undergrad at a tiny school in Iowa called Graceland University, and that's where I kind of fell into running. I played basketball growing up and loved it. I loved the strength conditioning stuff. I got to do some of that in high school, and that's kind of what brought me to wanting to stay in athletics in some way, and eventually led me to PT school. But when I was in undergrad, I had a professor, my biomechanics professor. His name was Dr. Chris Easton. He's from England, and I just loved his teaching. And he was slanted towards running because his PhD work had been in Kenyans and their adaptations to living at altitude. So that's kind of what he had published in at his previous university. And so I connected right away with him. He got me to buy The Lore of Running, which is this book by Tim Noakes. It's a massive book. And I read it, and then and that's what got me into, like, he recommended Franz Bosch's book. So I read that one. And so, I got Jay's book when I was at PT school. So, like, working with him and then kind of experimenting with my own training, because college was the first time I didn't have a coach or a team I was associated with. That's kind of how I got into distance running, is because I had some extra time. I like being active. I'm going to start running. Plugging my mileage into a calculator on Runner's World website, and all these other kind of things. But that led me to PT school. And then in school, I was supposed to do an internship with Dr. Easton, who had then moved back to England. So the original plan was we had a 6 week kind of specialized clinical that you were supposed to do at the end of PT school that last semester. And so I had coordinated with him. I'm going to come over and work in your lab. I'm going to, you're going to teach me how to do all this stuff. I'll stay in London for 6 weeks and I'll live wherever I live. I'll figure it out. But I'm just going to go kind of do that. And then at the last minute that fell through. So I couldn't get my PT program to approve it, which I was very upset about. But it ended up working that I texted an old colleague of mine that I had shadowed growing up, who had started at a new company, a sports clinic in Kansas City. And so I did an internship there and eventually took a job there after graduation. So was there for 6 weeks and then started working there maybe 3 or 4 months later, after I passed boards. And that was it was a very progressive clinic. At the time this was 2012. It looked like a performance gym. And that's very common now. That was much less common when I got out of school, where there was turf fields and Kaiser equipment. And it was very much modeled after, athletes' performance at the time. It's called Exos now. And kind of similar to you, it was, you'd see some Medicare and post-op during the middle of the day, total knees, total hips, labor repairs, rotator cuff repairs, all that kind of stuff. But then really in the morning and then after school, afternoon and evening, it was really all athletes. So high school, college kids, it was active adults. No one wanted to treat runners at that clinic, so I was lucky that I would get all of them. So I basically, the scheduler liked me. Her name was Melissa, and I was basically like, Melissa, I'll get you whatever you want. Just put all the runners on my schedule. And I worked there for a few years, and it was great. And it was a ton of reps. It was a ton of experience, and it was a lot of just figure it out. I had really good mentors there. My old boss, Ryan and Travis, my bosses, Ryan and Travis, they were very supportive, great clinicians. But it was very much like, you're going to figure it out or you're going to go somewhere else, which isn't a bad thing. And I really, really enjoyed that environment. And I think that, I probably wasn't as focused on the literature back then. Well, I definitely wasn't as I am now. But I gained a lot of experience, just doing that and then learning from other clinicians that had worked in sports for a long time. And I think that, when we get asked about, how do I get into running? How do I start my own business? What do I, when you get out of school, what do you do? I think that the main thing is you have to get experience, and it has to be in person, and it needs to be in a non-distracted environment, which is very challenging now. And so, I really think that just exposure to working with people while trying to be critical of what you're doing and learn along the way, whatever population you want to work with, whether it's runners, it's soccer players, it's pelvic floor dysfunction, it's post-op, whatever it is, it's neuro, you need exposure. You have to get experience, and you really need to do that for a few years. And, everybody's situation is a little bit different. I would tell people, if that's something that you want to get good at, take the job that's going to be maybe even pay you a little less, because you need the experience. That's going to be the most important thing in the long run.
100%. And when did you branch out to do your own thing? I mean, what was sort of okay, this is I have to take the plunge?
Yeah. So my first job, I would work really 12-hour shifts. And so it was as a new grad, I think you can do that a little bit, and there's other people that do it now, but, at the time, my wife and I, we just got married. We lived in an apartment. We didn't have kids. We didn't have pets. We didn't have a lot going on. And so both of us could really lean into our career from a time perspective a little bit more. So I worked there for a long time. And then, when we were about to have our first kid, I'm I can't be getting home at 8 o'clock, 4 nights a week. Leaving super early. We both have jobs, something has to change. And so I knew I wanted to start working my way into something that was more of my own. Cause when I had kind of built a running program at my first job, but I knew that when I left, that would go away. At least that would go away for me, and it, in all likelihood, it would go away at the clinic too. Because if you don't have someone running that, it's not gonna last. And so I ended up taking another job for about a year and a half, that was much less busy. Um, and I was bored out of my mind. About 6 weeks, I remember the first week was great because I'm like, oh, like the pressure's not here. Like, to be critical, like I could just kind of show up and go along, and that felt fine for about 5 days. And then I'm like, oh, this isn't going to work either. So I'm going to have to do this myself. And so about a week into that next job, I'm like, I'm going to have to go out on my own. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I need to, I'm going to act the way that I am going to do what I need to do. So whenever I can move out on my own, I can do it. And so about a year and a half later, I left and started my own business. And I've done that for 6 or 7 years now. Um, and that's been, it's been great and stressful and absolutely not what I thought it would be. And when I look at my day now, if I were to told you this is what I do, say my last year PT school, if I would look at my schedule now, I'd be like, well, that doesn't sound. I thought I was going to go work in a gate lab. I wanted to go work in a gate lab and watch runners run all day. Like that was what I was set on. I'm either going to start my own gate lab or I'm going to go work at one, and I'll treat runners and that'll be it. Had no intentions of really trying to do anything outside of that. And then, as you've experienced too, opportunities and things change over time, and maybe you end up doing something a little different.
And what was the impetus for you to really start, going on a deep dive with regards to bone stress injuries? Because that's become a huge focal point of your work and what you're sharing online. Obviously, you're sharing other stuff, but when people bring up your name, I think they associate, Nathan with bone stress injuries these days.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's what a lot of my caseload is, and it's a lot of the performance clients that I work with. It's the maybe their past medical history has they've struggled with those, and so how do we train at a high level and not run into another one of those? It's always a challenging thing, but so I remember I was working at the time I was working at Crow's Coffee. So there's a coffee shop below the treadmill studio that I worked at it when I first started. So there's a treadmill studio in Kansas City. It's Casey Endurance. They're two running coaches, Jeremy and Jessica Hammer, great people. They had approached me at my last job and said, "Hey, we're going to start this studio. Would you be interested in subleasing or coming in and kind of being the PT that was there?" And I remember going home and being like, "Well, I'm not a risk taker, but with that, it was like, I gotta, after about a week, I'm like, I gotta go do it. I gotta do it right now, or I'm going to end up quitting and not being a PT. I'll go do something else. And so Crow's is this coffee shop below where we were. And I remember you and I had started working together. We had started talking. I had done some mentorship stuff with you online, and I really wanted to try to get.
About.
Well, yeah. And so I had really started to realize like I need a better understanding of just about everything, because at that point I had a lot of experience. I had seen a lot of runners, seen a lot of ACL repairs, lots of knees, lots of hips, because I had worked in these very busy clinics, and I had if there was a challenging case or a high level athlete, like I always wanted that. Like I want the pressure of those types of situations. I like doing that. And so I had a lot of experience, but I didn't have a great understanding of maybe the literature behind a lot of the topics that I was seeing. And so I remember I had started on to go through the hip joint. And so I had looked at, some of the research that looked at, FAI and labral tears and hip anatomy. And I had a little brown notebook that I still have, and I would just take notes. So I'd be like, this is this study. This is the findings. Here's a few things. And I would go to Crow's about every day, and I would just slowly work through the hip. So for whatever reason, I started there. And then the second topic was stress fractures. And to be honest, I didn't really know anything about them. I mean, aside from what I see a lot now, which is like, okay, you've been diagnosed with this injury. You can start running in 6 weeks. My background had been in, again, very heavily influenced in exercise from a rehab standpoint, and so we would basically just build a progressive lower extremity strengthening program for 6 weeks, and then we'd start your run progression. And we'd use the run progression from Brigham and Women's Hospital that everybody else used, and that was literally it. And you'd get to like 3 or 4 minutes, and then I wouldn't see anymore. And so, and a lot of people get better with that. But when I started going through the bone stress injury literature, which I remembered for one of the first papers was um, it was by Stuart Warden and Irene Davis, and I think it's either Adam Timfordy or Michael Fredrickson as the third author, but it's Management and Prevention of Bone Stress Injuries. So it's in long distance runners. So it's this kind of paper that came out in 2014 on the factors that go into it. And I remember reading that and being like, oh, like I don't know anything about any of this. And so what had started with the hip eventually went to stress fractures, and then since then it's been the same thing. It's like, okay, this is the article that I'm reading this week, and I've really done that for 6 years. So trying to learn and then kind of pair that with what I see in the clinic, and then over time, like as you'd mentioned, like these opportunities have popped up. So at some point, we decided, okay, well, we're gonna teach a course called Bones, Tendons, Weights, and Whistles, and I'm going to teach the bones part. And so, which when we taught that the first time at Lake Washington, right before the pandemic, you know, the slides were like tons of information because that's where my head was at the time, and I hope it's a little bit more simplified now. But it started with just learning about that, and then it's like, well, I wonder if other PTs would like to know about this. So maybe let's do a stress fracture cohort, because you and I had done a resistance training cohort. We'd done a couple of those where like basically we would take 6 weeks and we would teach you on resistance training, which again, that was my biggest experience. I mean, I had started, and we mentioned this in the podcast a few episodes ago. I had started lifting with runners right out of the gate, out of PT school, and I've had a fairly steady roster since then. And so I had lots of experience with that. So we had taught that cohort, and then I'm like, well, I could do that on stress fractures probably. And since then, it's like, well, there's been speaking engagements, and you and I teach, and I'll do mentorships, and certainly lots of patients and things like that. But that all has come from me kind of starting to read those papers at the front little bench in Crow's Coffee, and being like I don't know any of this, like, and trying to just stay patient over the last so many years of learning all of it, because it's a lot. And then also realizing like, oh, there's way more than even this stuff talks about that we probably need to think about. So that's how that kind of came up. And so one of the benefits that I think that myself and you both experienced was like there wasn't, especially early on, there wasn't as much pressure to have a social media presence and maybe to be distracted by other things. There was more of an opportunity to try to learn and grow and have less other stuff coming in, which I think has been very helpful. And I think that's very challenging right now. So yeah, that's how the bone stress injury stuff came around.
Yeah, well, it's awesome, and talk about an area where people really need to learn more about. So you've sort of stepped in and filled that void, and I think it's always great to have someone who always has one foot in the clinic, because
Yeah.
I think if you don't, you start to get rusty in terms of how you actually apply this information. It's great to be able to spit out a bunch of random facts. It's another thing to be able to integrate it and get results. And like you said, a lot of times patients will come in and you'll work with them for a few weeks and you're like, oh, they must be better. Well, they're not
Yeah.
better. They probably tried to get back to running and then ended up having another setback. But yeah, it's fun when people do get this stuff right, and they stay patient, and they realize that this is going to be a process. You can't rush biology. I just had a bunch of athletes who last year, for whatever reason, like all of a sudden my whole schedule was bone stress injuries.
Hmm.
And I think that was just basically, the aftermath of the pandemic to a certain extent. But all of them this year have just been crushing it. And it's so fun to see, and just for people to trust in the process. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, that I
Yeah.
do
I
think
think, I
your
think, I
your
think that,
point, like,
sorry, I think that,
oh, go ahead.
with a lot of this stuff, like it's really important when you're getting out of school to challenge yourself, but not overwhelm yourself. So, you know, people can get that going through. So people talk about like residencies and fellowships and certifications and all those kind of things. You know, pros and cons to all of that, right? And but I do think that having a having a path where you're working through something that is a little challenging. It's not terribly challenging. This is like workouts, right? Like you're not trying to run a minute faster than what your workout it says because that's too much, you know, or you're not trying to put 50 more pounds on the bar when 5 would do. Like you want to be just on the edge of your ability from a learning standpoint, from a whatever you're doing business wise, and
Everything.
continue to do that over time. Otherwise, you stagnate, or you don't get used to dealing with difficulty, which is the other thing with this. Like this is like reading to me. So it's challenging to read a book. You know, not for some people, but for a lot of people, it is challenging. It's challenging for some people to read a research study. And part of that is because I think it's hard. And so if you're not reading research, don't start with like I've got to read everything on the meniscus, you know? Like starting with like pick one topic and read a little bit and think about it and then come back to it in a little later. Um and so I think having things like that in your career is really important so you progress, whether that's a specific injury or whether that's um, communication, that's writing, that's, whatever the thing is that you want to work on, like having something that you're continuing to progress. So you're not just kind of just trying to keep your head above water. Like you're just kind of floating along.
So, I mean, this seems like a good segue to, just sort of riff a little bit on, if you were coming out of school right now, or say, you've been out 2 to 3 years and you feel like maybe you're lacking direction, what would be your advice to yourself now? Like with the experience and the knowledge that you've gained and knowing that we're both still on the journey, but what would be your advice to your younger self if you had just graduated or were a few years out, um, in terms of like putting yourself on the right path where you do start to sort of carve out this space or you do start to bring something to the table?
So we talk a little bit about this in our mastermind that we run every year. But I think that you do want to figure out your core values, like you as a person. So I do think that there's some introspection that you want to figure out first. This is something that, it's been a learning process for me with this. I think it's probably the same thing with you. Nobody has this all figured out. But I do think you want to figure out, like, why do I do the things that I do? What are the values that I can kind of have that help me with decision making, regardless of whether those are personal or professional decisions. But I do think that you want to figure out what you're about. Like what are you, what do you stand for? What are the things that are important to you? I think probably starting there is first. And then I think that you want to be in an environment where you're a little excited. And maybe that doesn't mean PT. So like my wife and I talk about this, both her and I we're very like ordered from a professional standpoint. I'm a little bit distracted personally, but professionally, when I came out of school, like I could tell you this is what the next 30 years is going to look like. I'm going to take this certification, and then I'm going to go do this and this and this and this. And so I could say exactly what was going to happen. And obviously none of that happened. But I think for both her and I, we were like, what we should have done when we graduated college? We probably should have gone and volunteered somewhere for a year. Like
Hmm.
some organization, some cause, like work for a nonprofit, go do something. I don't know. If you're interested in running, honestly, when you're getting out of PT school, treat some runners, but go be a volunteer coach. Go coach for Girls on the Run, volunteer as a coach at a high school. Do something that is not related to the thing that you're doing every day, and just kind of see where it takes you, and then expose yourself to different information and different ideas, and see what you're drawn towards. I think that's the main thing, and I think it's helpful if you are going into a clinic. First, I think that try to minimize the amount of stuff that you try to do right out of school. So this kind of goes back to the social media thing. Like if I graduated And I think this is the expectation now. Like if you graduate from school, you have to have a niche that you're going to work in. Obviously, like if you want to work in sports, you can't just work in sports. You have to be this type of person. Um, and no judgment, because you and I both do this, right? Like my client and patient load is runners. But like I think the expectation now is you graduate from school and you have to have a thing that you do. You also have to have a social media account that's going to talk about those things, and you have to have takes or stances on everything. Then I would say don't do any of that unless you really want to. Just like you and I talk with clinicians about this, like if you want to work with runners, you need to also start coaching. Then I would say don't do that.
Yeah.
Like figure out the main thing first. Like be in the clinic, like see a lot of patients, make a lot of people worse, make some people better, have no effect on a lot of people, piss some people off, work with difficult personalities, work with really nice people. Like that's the ebb and flow of working in a clinic, or at least in an outpatient clinic. So I think that's probably my one advice is like don't feel like you have to do a bunch of other stuff. Focus on the main thing first, and then make sure that you're giving yourself stuff to do outside of work that you enjoy. And we can get into like the relationship with work and all those other kind of things in a second if you want to. But that's probably what I would tell them. What about you? And find mentors. Like find people that whether they're online or other places where you're like, I like what this person is about. This kind of comes back to the core values. Like I like how they present their information. For whatever reason you connect with them. Like try to find people like that, whether that's in PT or in other fields. Like don't limit it to just the degree that you got, but try to think about other things too.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I mean, I think there's a reason why we start the mastermind off with core values. It's, because if you don't get crystal clear on your core values, and it's not enough to just have them up in your head, you need to write them down on paper and really whittle it down to say, like, what are the 4 to 5 things? Because, and they can change over time based on your experiences, but that's what's going to really help you anchor everything else that you do. I think that the point that you made about just you're big into habits. Me too. It's like you know to set a habit of reading. And you may not always be in the mood, but I know that like early in the morning, I like to wake up and read. It's a time where my kids they're still asleep, and it's just peaceful. It's quiet. I have really
Mm-hmm.
good energy in the morning, and that's been awesome. When I was in New York, I was on the trains. So, while a lot of people are fiddling, doing whatever on the train, I was writing blog posts or I was reading research articles. And that was every day, train ride there, train ride home. If the train got delayed, that meant more reading, more writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having to write about the stuff that you're learning, and,
Yeah.
one of the things that we're very adamant about and we invest a lot of time and energy into is a newsletter. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, to an extent it's cathartic, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also, we're trying to be a resource for people. And this is not trying to grow some monstrosity of a list. It's just formulating and articulating your thoughts on a certain topic. And, you'll be surprised how many people are interested in this, especially if you're speaking to any pain points. And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
always have to be, speaking to people's challenges or pain points. It could be sharing something that you've read, just thinking about the totality of your life and what you want to share with people. Which can be very helpful in terms of building trust and alliance with people. And, that's your number one marketing asset. And I don't want to turn this into a marketing course, but um, yeah. And I think to dabble in things outside, as much as we encourage people to read about things related to the field, scientific articles or books, to also read stuff that you think is completely unrelated, because you're going to start probably drawing parallels or finding a lot of similarities to this stuff. And it's going to help you just, I think, develop a little bit more of a global understanding of the human condition. And I think also to have a movement practice, whether that's running, whether that's yoga, whether it's, you name it. I think something
Mm-hmm.
where you're ideally brought into a community of people too. Um, so yeah, there's a lot, but I think that the number one thing for anyone who is, in this field, physical therapy, chiropractic, rehab, personal training, is you have to learn to focus. The people that we consult a lot of times from an entrepreneurial standpoint, or clinicians who are looking to really like niche down or carve out their path, have a hell of a time focusing, and
Hmm.
you have to put your phone on silent. We were spoiled because we didn't have to deal with this,
Yeah, I know.
but I think that drives so much of the burnout. When people are like, I'm burned out, I'm like, of course you are. You're on your fucking phone all day long, Like
Yeah.
there's nothing good that comes from that. And it's like when you power it off, if you have to lock it, in a box, give it to your partner, like you have to sit down with your thoughts. And if you don't do that, all bets are off.
Yeah, couple things off what you said. So the writing practice thing I think is important because you do want to figure out your own ideas on things, even if you don't publish it. So you can have a notes app, you can have a hand notebook, whatever you want to. But I think doing something where you're working through ideas and thoughts, I think just the act of doing that is important. And then every once in a while, stuff comes out of that that can be really impactful. I think that's really really essential. Um, and I think it is very, especially in our fields, and especially if you work with endurance athletes, the idea that you would spend time in a non-productive mode is really, really hard. And so I know it sounds silly, but I'm similar to you. Like when I wake up in the morning, I wake up. I normally that's between 5:30 and 6. I hop in the shower, I brush my teeth, and then I go walk my dog, and I don't take my phone with me when I walk my dog. We walk like a 20-minute loop around our house, and then I come home. And if my kids are not awake yet, hopefully, I'll read until they wake up, and sometimes I'll read a little longer too. And then I really start my workday at like 7:30, or I'm like making waffles and getting kids dressed and all the things that we do as parents in the morning. But like I really think you have to have space in your day when it is just you're allowing your mind to wander. Like if you read any kind of professional development books, they'll talk about that. Walking, they'll talk about time alone, they'll talk about time in nature, they'll talk about all those kind of things where you're just letting yourself go. I think that's really essential. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are drawn to running. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are drawn to ultra running now, where it's like I'm gonna be gone in the woods for 24 hours without a phone. And so as much as possible, you try to orient your life around that. I've started. This is the upstairs of my house. I've started charging my phone in here at night, because I don't want it in my bedroom. I was talking with a client about this yesterday morning because she's very much a motivated, successful person in her field. About the idea that like you need to get your phone away from you at night if you feel like you're having to check it all the time right before you go to sleep. Like that's not helpful. So let's figure out a way to get that out of where you're sleeping. Um, so yeah, I think that time alone is really important. It's also uncomfortable. Like I think it's the same thing with reading research. If you want to read a research study or you want to read a book that is not, maybe it's not exactly what you like, there's some resistance, right? Like if you talk about Stephen Pressfield talks about this, there's some resistance to that. Like it's hard to read academic writing. It's hard to be by yourself. It's a lot easier to flip around on your phone. And it's not to say you always have to do that, but I do think that giving yourself time outside of work where you are thinking and trying to process through things, that will be very beneficial. And that's a skill that we just don't see as much anymore. A couple of years ago, I had a high school kid that lifted with me. She trained with me for a few years, and she would check her phone between every set of every exercise. So it'd be like a set of split squats, walk over, check my phone on the table, come back, second set of split squats. Like that was her habit. And I'm like, we're cutting that out. Like I don't know what you're doing at home, but we're not doing that in here. And so I think giving
So
yourself time to
disruptive.
be, yeah, to be in a non-distracted environment and think through things and then try to figure out your thoughts, that's something that's so easily lost. Um, for young clinicians coming out, and especially if you have, aspirations to do your own thing or grow your niche with a certain population or wherever you think you might go. Um, Having some time to process through it's really really important.
Yeah. The other thing, I don't know, I think this sort of ties into part of this discussion. I was listening to the podcast that Rich Roll did with Kevin Kelly, and I think it was maybe like 5 or 6 episodes ago. And I really like the point that he made, and you alluded to this a little bit. Like, hey, go and do some sort of work when you first get out of school, whether it's coaching or doing something. I mean, Kevin Kelly was making the point, like, go screw around. Like, yes, if you take a job, you have responsibilities to your employer, but also, like, when you're young, go screw around, go experiment, go get yourself into shit. You know,
Yeah.
and that was one of the main reasons everyone always said, "Hey, why didn't you go and do a residency? You could have gone to get a PhD, you could have gone to do XYZ." And I have a lot of respect for anyone who goes through that process. But for me, it was getting to New York. I was immersed. I'm a pig in poop with physical therapy. Um,
Hmm.
I loved my time at NISMAT, but I also screwed around in New York. I was hanging around all different walks of life, constantly, and that was such an invaluable decade of my life that really just gave me perspective, and I think allowed me to sort of continue to be very interested in what we do professionally.
Hmm.
So yeah. Now don't end up in jail or do something do something dumb, but yeah, take the pressure off, when you don't have all these commitments and responsibilities, go learn about yourself, because
Hmm.
those days they fly by fast.
Yeah.
Especially if you start a family, like, so
Yeah. And if you have something that draws your interest, investigate it, but don't like,
yeah.
but slowly, so Cal Newport, we've talked about him before. He's an author, and he talks about the idea of slow productivity. So, like for me with Bones, it was, I mean, this has been now a 5 6 year learning process. Um, if you're interested in something, whatever it is, slowly work through it. Give yourself time to think about it. And again, with like the social media stuff, don't feel like you have to. If you want to share your thoughts, if you want to do that, you can do that on your own. You don't have to do that on the internet. Um, and just give yourself give some patience and take your time through it, working through it.
Yeah, so much of this stuff is pacing, right? And there's a fellow who's definitely in the limelight right now, Alex Hormozy. And he always says it's like, the longer you can stay in the game, that's a goal. So you don't want to just sort of bleed your energy. Just think of, like, how do you pace yourself? Read maybe one article a week, maybe write one passage, or if it's a blog post, whatever you want to do, maybe do that. We do our newsletters once a month.
Hmm.
It's these little things, but over time the collective body of work becomes so massive.
Hmm.
um, so I was thinking about, I hit my 10-year anniversary being in Seattle, and it
Hmm.
went by like that. But I think all the shit that you and I have done, the stuff that I've done athletically, with my family, professionally, and it's the ultimate reminder just how much ground you can cover. And I always think of everything in in decades. It's like,
Hmm.
this is a decade, I'm going to focus on X. This is a decade, I'm going to focus on Y. So just always play the long game with this stuff, and just nurture relationships, and good things are going to happen.
I also think I do want to touch a little bit on kind of relationship with work because I think that's a challenging thing too. Um, I think it's really easy to tie your how you feel with how things are going with your patients. So I would say watch that.
Hmm.
I know I did that,
Yeah.
like especially when I first started. Like someone comes in and they have knee pain and they're going to see me again in 3 days or whenever. Man, those next 2 days, I'm like, I hope they're doing better. Like, they're going to come in. I know they're in at 1 p.m. on Thursday. Hope things are going, like it's really easy to start to just think about that all the time. And as you learn over time, like there's a lot of reasons into why people get better, get worse, don't, stay the same. And so putting less investment into that, like it's not that you don't want to be invested in your patients' outcomes and in developing relationships with patients, because I think that's another thing that sometimes we get advised on, like keep a distance between you and the patient, which is appropriate. But also like it's okay to care about people. And so, that's an easy thing that people will get into early on, I think, is like being very tied to outcomes and how they're feeling just in general. And some of that comes with having some other things in your life that aren't just work, that isn't just patient care or coaching or whatever it is. So you're not like hanging on to like your athlete's outcomes or hanging on to your patient's outcomes. And trying to have some type of a separation between your professional life and your life outside.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I know you and I probably were both guilty of that early on, where I was always so concerned about, the outcomes of the people I was
Yeah.
working with, especially if they were post surgical, because I'm like, shit, they went through this big procedure. The onus is on me. And I think it's easy for us to sit here and say at this point in time, like, yeah, try to separate, and that is our advice. But I think that
Yeah.
comes also through experience and repetition, where you're like,
Of course.
man, there's a lot of moving parts here, and we don't probably even know the half of them,
Yeah.
so, don't hold yourself accountable. And, and we've talked about this before, but I just say when people come to see me anymore, I just say, hey, I'm in a good position to troubleshoot with you. But because that sort of reminds them that they're the ones who have to take ownership of their situation. You can't will any agenda on them. And if they have a great outcome, fantastic, bravo. If they have a suboptimal outcome, hey, let's keep working. I think there's still room. But yeah, don't take the pressure off yourself. And I think that is one of the most liberating things that you can do as a clinician, and just embrace that idea of like you're there to troubleshoot, and the better your
Hmm.
communication is, the more likely you are to help that person pull the right levers to improve their situation.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
caring, like you said, just give a shit about people.
Yeah.
I was talking on the Runner Zone last night. I had a woman who consulted me, and she was in for some posterior tib complaints, and we got those addressed. And after that initial consultation, she started developing some hip pain. And I was on the phone with her last night because I'm concerned that it's a bone stress injury. And I'm like, look, that
Hmm.
was 10:30 at night. Like, because I
Yeah. Yeah.
care. Like, I don't want this woman to have a sinister situation that could negatively impact her life because I wasn't accessible. Now, I just happen to be on my phone. So you have to make sure you have
Yeah.
some barriers in place. But by the same token, like there's a time and place where sometimes you have to make some exceptions. And, because if she went through today and she is dealing with a bone stress injury, and for whatever reason, it got more advanced, well, that's not a good situation if you're dealing with a high risk site, as you well know.
Yeah. Well, and one more thing, I think that also like be very cautious of hustle culture. So this idea of like
Yes.
always working, always more stuff, always more money, um, always more, 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 more. Um, I think that's all garbage. I think that everybody's situation is different. So there is a level, there's an amount of time, money, accessibility. Like everybody's got a different circumstance. But I think this idea that you need to just constantly do more, make more, that is a massive problem for lots of people. And just like I was guilty of this too. It's like, oh, I want to work with professional athletes. I want to make this much. I want to do this thing. And now that, and I hear your experience with this too. Like when you have some of those goals, whatever they are, when you check them off, it's kind of like, oh, well, I did that. And that's, but that it's not
Hmm.
like it's not the Super Bowl parade, you know? It's not like, oh, and now
Anticlimactic.
like life is the best because I whatever. You know, it's not like that, you know, and so have goals and aspirations, but also like just adding more on, or like if you get to like throw your name in with somebody or do something else, like it's not gonna it's not gonna give you everything. Like work isn't gonna provide all that for you.
It'll probably pull you away from your family and your hobbies and the things you really
Yeah.
enjoy doing, and that's a trap, right?
Yeah, for
I've
sure.
been guilty I've been guilty as hell of that, where it's like
Yeah.
I want to keep doing more and make more money and have more of a reputation, and now I'm just like fuck it all. Not quite. I shouldn't be cursing. But
Yeah.
but that's sort of, it's like, what's important to me. It's like, hey, seeing my kids in the morning, catching up with my buddy Darren to train in the middle of the day because it's beautiful in Seattle. And you know what? I get back from those training sessions and I feel like $1 million and I'm so focused, you know,
Yeah.
and just knowing that working yourself to death is just going to land you with health problems and you're going to be bad energy and no one's going to want to be
Yeah.
around you. So,
And
you and
that's
I
not
have
to say
gone
that
through
there
growing pains, man, with all the shit we
yeah.
do,
Yeah, there's and that's not to say
you
I
know?
did a newsletter on this a few months ago. It's not to say that aren't going to be like a lot of some times where you're going to have to invest a lot of time and energy, and life will not be balanced. So like if you're opening up a business,
Yeah.
you if you really want to see it succeed, you're probably going to have to invest a whole lot of time and money and resources and those kind of things into it to see if you can get the outcome you want. I think the danger is that then sets the habit that, you know, I can't then pull back from this. So when you talk about that, I feel the same way. Like if you looked at my schedule when I first opened up, it was terrible. You know, I worked all the
Mhm.
time, and over time I've been able to wrangle that a little bit more to now where it's like I take my kids to school 4 days a week. I coach their sports teams. I make dinner a few nights a week. Like I work hard when I during my day when I'm working, and I really try to have a lot of time outside of that that's not working at all. But finding that rhythm, it might take some upfront imbalance, you know.
Mhm.
But staying in that is not going to be helpful. I see that I see this with PTs sometimes in business people where they're like, you know, they set all these revenue goals. I'm going to do this year. I'm going to do this year. I'm going to do this thing. I'm like, yeah. I mean, if you accomplish your goals, great. Just make sure that you realize when you get that thing, it's not gonna change life drastically.
Yeah, 100%. Um, yeah, balance. We were talking about this. I mean, quarter one, quarter two, you and I are generally like on the gas,
Yeah.
but there's a great book called Do Pause. It's part of the Do Book company or series by this guy Robert Poynton. And I think it was Henry Rollins who said this, but there are inhalation and exhalation periods. There's an ebb and
Hmm.
flow,
Yeah.
and this is the laws of nature. These are
Yeah.
universal, and if you try
Yep.
to buck them or not play by them, you're going to get your ass handed to you. Whether
Yeah.
that's getting sick, getting injured, doing something that negatively impacts your business or relationships. You have to sort of just roll with this ebb and flow. Not to say there's not a
Hmm.
time to be on the gas, but I think the more you just sort of start to respect it, it promotes leading a healthier and happier existence.
Hmm. And you'll probably do better in all the things you wanted to do better in anyway. You know, I know that's been my
Yeah.
experience. Like when I have had a more maybe balanced approach to my week and like the seasons of life, work tends to go better. More things tend to come up, like more opportunities tend to come up. When I am, you know, on the gas 100%, just like, you know, caffeine, high intensity all the time, there's normally a cliff. It's normally
Hmm.
something will then tell you that you're going to stop. And normally for me, that's I'll get sick or I'll get an injury or something. So, you know, you might think that you're in control, but the your body, the universe, it will tell you to stop in some way.
In what you had said earlier about patient care, I always think back to, there are times where I'm like, wow, everyone, just seems like they're crushing it, they're getting better. And then there are times where
Yeah,
I'm like, man, everyone's
I
like,
suck.
just
I'm
they
terrible at this.
regress today.
Yeah.
That's a reflection of our state more than we realize
Oh,
it.
for sure.
It's like, 'cause if you're spread thin, you're going to be short with people, you're going to rush them, you're not as invested in there. So yeah, it's like, that's the other thing I always sit back and laugh about. Um, anyways, well, hey, this was a fun chat.
Yeah.
Hopefully it gets people thinking a little bit. And yeah, we love talking about this stuff, and just trying to open up doors, because I do think the pressures are, and pro athletes talk about this, like, having to contend with all the distractions and social media is like, we create these undue pressures on ourselves. And
Hmm.
that was sort of the impetus for our mastermind, is like to teach people there's a different way, and
Yeah.
there's a way that you can sort of like work yourself and who you are into your business. And if you're not doing that and you're a small group practice or a solopreneur, like, you're missing the game.
Yeah.
So cool. um all right, man, I have a patient showing up with a bone stress injury, so I'll
Yeah.
keep you posted.
Good.
um
Good luck.
any other
We
final
both.
thoughts?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. I'm What am I making
Cool.
tonight? I'm making. Have you ever had McGriddles before from McDonald's? Have you ever had one of those before?
Yeah, but not in a long while. Yeah.
So I'm making those on the
You
grill
making
tonight.
your trip?
That's what my
Awesome.
son wanted for the last day of school. So I will be making basically pancake sandwiches tonight. So I've got that, and
Yeah.
I'm going to work a little bit between now and when they get home, and then I'm going to make McGriddles, and then I think we're going to. What are we watching tonight? Not the Mario movie, but I don't remember. It's another kids movie that he wants. So like we did this with our other son when
Movie
he
night.
finished his preschool year. So it's like, hey, we're gonna like, what do you want for dinner? We'll watch a movie. It's your day. So we got that the rest of the night. So it'll be good.
Yeah, they're probably stoked.
Yeah. Or he'll be grumpy. We'll see when he
All
gets
right,
home.
man. Yeah, no way, grumpy. Last day of school.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, man. Good to catch up, and thanks to everyone who tunes into the Runner Zone. And we had a little bit of a hiatus, but we're back in the mix, and consistent with the ebb and flow that we were just talking about.
That's right. Have
All right,
a
Nathan.
good day, everybody.
Regards to the family. Take care.